they knew that Cody, there was something different, but they didn't know what it was at first. And they were able to see different parts of his body. His kidneys were enlarged. The baby was, you know, it was a big fetus, and but they kept trying to see his head, and they couldn't see any features. And then finally one day he turned, and they focused in on the tongue and saw that he had macroglossia. And so with the enlarged kidneys, the large size, the macroglossia, and the polyhydramnios, they sent me to a specialist who then told me that I was going to have a child that had Beckwith syndrome. He was very big, and he had a protruding tongue that we didn't know. We had seen on ultrasounds, we had seen one shot where he had stuck his tongue out and he would play with it, but it would never come back in. And then when he was born and we saw that it wasn't going back in and that it was protruding, then we asked more about the syndrome, because all we were told was the child had Beckwith syndrome and he would be retarded to some form. When Cody was little, you know, we knew that we needed to address his tongue to see what needed to be done with that, because he had the macroglossia and his tongue was always protruding, and he was extremely loud. We can go outside and could hear him breathing in the house. But his sugars were so involved that we didn't want to combine one incident on top of the other. We wanted to address the hypoglycemic issues first, and as soon as we got that taken care of, then we would have addressed the tongue, because he was still eating and breathing okay. We would have to hold his chin really tight, you know, with pressure in order for him to latch on to a nipple so he could drink, but he was doing it. And so we set that on the back burner, and Cody, when he breathed, it was really loud and raspy, and he was having apnea episodes, where he would actually stop breathing. And so they went ahead and took his adenoids and tonsils out, and were quite surprised how enlarged they were. In fact, the tonsils, instead of just being, you know, central right at the back of the throat, they continued on down. So they said that they were quite enlarged. As Beckwith is an overgrowth syndrome, you know, all aspects of the body can be affected, and the tissues included. He was 15 months when he had the tonsils and adenoids removed. We had to literally touch him to see if he was breathing, because he was so quiet. We couldn't hear him now. And so it went well, and we weren't worried about his airway being blocked. But then he drooled. His tongue was always out, and he drooled so much. We used to say that we go through 70 bibs a day. He would just saturate himself. And we talked to the doctors down at Children's, and they could never give us a definite answer about this surgery, because it wasn't a common one. And because of that, they didn't make us feel comfortable that it was something we wanted to put Cody through. And we didn't know what the outcome would be. They said that they're done, you know, here and there, and what the outcome of that particular surgery would be as opposed to other, you know, common surgeries, they don't know. So we asked for all the heads of the departments of the craniofacial team to sit down and discuss and see what they thought about Cody. And one by one, the head doctor said no, he didn't think that Cody needed this tongue reduction, because he's eating and breathing and starting to babble okay. But one by one, all the other surgeons said, I agree with so-and-so. However, if I were to do the tongue reduction, I would do the keyhole, or I would do the anchor cut, or I would do the pie shape. So on one hand, they were saying they agree with somebody, but on the other hand, oh, I can do it. And so that left us even more confused. And then we had one doctor tell us that she's seen other older children, and especially the boys, that if the tongue reduction isn't done at an early stage, and it does expand the jaw, that as the child gets older and is involved in the decision making, that the boys have a tendency not to have anything done, because they get that square jaw model look. And so that was enough to set us at ease, and so we decided we wouldn't go through it. As Cody became older, I started to notice when he was sleeping, he would snore really loud. And so I started watching him in his sleep and started taking pictures. And then I'd catch him with his tongue protruding. And so I talked to Dr. Marsh, who was with the Beckwith-Wiedemann Registry, and asked him what his impression was of this. And he had asked me if this is how he always sleeps. And I had told him yes. And he says, well, before I give you a decision, I'd like to have photos and molds done. So we had some molds done and then the photos. And while they were taking the photos by the orthodontist, they noticed his airway was very narrowed because the tongue was pushing back into, he was taught to keep the tongue in his mouth, but it had nowhere to go except for up and back. So it was blocking the airway, so she recommended for us to go and have a sleep study done. So in going through the sleep study, we learned that the respiratory disturbance index, or the RDIs, it's how many times he stops breathing in an hour, were 15.7, which is quite high. And so the pulmonologist recommended for us to have the have a glossectomy done, which is the term for a tongue reduction. So we sent all this information down to Dr. Marsh, and then after seeing everything and looking at all of Cody's medical charts and notes, then he too agreed that this is something that would be beneficial for Cody, and so we started planning for it. Cody was worried because he didn't see why would he have to have a tongue reduction if Gene Simmons from KISS didn't. And so we tried to explain to him that he has a different tongue than Gene Simmons does. You know, he has one of overgrowth, and there's other concerns with him. And in time, if he didn't have this and he wasn't getting the air that he needed, it would take a toll on his heart.
Well, my tongue was like down to my chin, and then like at school when I was like drawing and such, when I was concentrating hard enough, like my tongue would come down, and a lot of kids kept on teasing me, like, and saying, put your tongue back in your mouth. And that hurt me sometimes because it's like kind of embarrassing.
So we went down, and he was worried about all the tricks that he could do prior to the surgery and if he would be able to do them afterwards.
And I used to be able to twist my tongue all the way around. And I used to be able to touch my chin with it and my nose. And it's really gross one you do not want to hear about.
He would miss his tongue because now it's become a part of him. And but then he finally, after thinking about it for a while, decided that, you know, let's go for it. And so we went down to St. Louis, and he was 10 years of age. He underwent the tongue reduction.
Well, I'm not quite sure because they had me sleep when I was before the surgery and during the surgery, of course. And I remember them, I think Mom told me that they pulled my tongue out and they like marked where they had to cut. And the way of doing it was like what Dr. Marsh does. He makes it a forked tongue so it's in the shape of a W, and then he stitches up the part where the indent is. And ever since before my surgery, my tongue was down to here, and now it's just right to here.
And right after, it was hard for him because he was like losing an old friend, and you know, he wished he had it back, and he couldn't do this or he couldn't do that, and he was pretty miserable. But then as time went on and it started to heal and he could start to eat again and could start to talk, he started noticing all the different things he could do. And as the tongue started healing, he was able to do all those old tricks that he could do, with the exception of touching his nose. Prior to his surgery, because of his sleep apnea, he was put on a CPAP machine, it stands for continuous positive airway pressure, which forces the air down the air passage. And so Cody would wear it, and he would wear a complete mask that would cover his nose and his mouth. And he would wear that at night when he slept, and it had a little hose on it that was attached to a machine. And after his surgery, he no longer needed it. So he's improved quite a bit.
Well, I want to be either a cartoonist or a movie director or so.